I'm continuing my coverage of the World Under-20 Championship taking place in Mexico City. And this game is from the penultimate round, round 10. And features Santiago Avila from Colombia and Luka Budisavljevic from Serbia. So this was, one of the leading boards. I should say going into this round, Marc-Andrea Morizzi from France was leading, but these two were just behind. So this is a very, very important game. And this game taps into a lot of the themes that I've been discussing over the past few weeks. It starts out as a Spanish, but very soon we're going to get into a kind of King's Indian pawn structure, and we can see it's all about when you should advance on the king side, or if you should advance on the king side, and perhaps what to do about it. Well, okay, more later. So this ancient system, d6, is quite popular at the moment because it keeps more tension in the position than a lot of the main lines which have been rather played out. And there are loads of ways that white can play this. I think white plays in quite a traditional way with castles and then c3 and d4. But here, for example, there's a big alternative for white, which is simply to take here and go d4. That leads to very different kind of positions. That's another story. But castles, the traditional move, bishop d7, c3 and g6. So it's a slightly more aggressive position for the bishop than on e7. And this fianchetto system is pretty popular, actually. What you're inviting white to do is push that pawn, and then when the knight goes back, you can see already we're getting a kind of King's Indian formation here. That's why, yes, it's good to study individual variations, but if you understand a position type like this, then your knowledge switches from the Spanish to the King's Indian. So it's not just individual variations one has to learn in the opening to understand the system. Okay, so here we go. Bishop e3. White maintains more tension. It is possible to push with d5, but bishop e3 just holds things for the moment. Let me just, before we look at the game, let me just give you an idea of the kind of dynamism that's contained within black's position. This is a game an online game between Firuzja and Carlsen that went rook e1. Went like this, just very quickly. So Firuzja is playing in a very standard way. But watch out, because now Carlsen exchanged and played here, hitting that bishop, and then hit out with c5. And you can see that black's pieces have a lot of pressure here. That bishop on g7 is certainly coming into the game. So it could switch into a kind of Benoni setup if white locks the position down with d5, for example. So yeah, you've got to be pretty flexible. Okay, so bishop e3, knight f6, knight d2, defends the e-pawn, black castles h3, that's to stop this, potentially this move, and h6. So you can see there is tension in the middle of the board, and it's not clear whether white should push on, whether white should take. I mean, if white takes here, that would just dampen down everything. Not a bad move, because positions like this means this bishop on g7 isn't up to much. But one could also play knight takes, and that would just relieve a lot of the pressure by exchanging pieces. But Avila plays rook e1 just to hold the tension, and rook e8, so this tension is still in the position, and bishop c2. So that defends this pawn, because there was a latent threat there to exchange on d4. And a5 from black. So this looks a little bit strange, but it's to just hold up b4 in case white exchanged here and then went b4 afterwards. So yeah, just gaining a little space on the queen side, and this has some relation to King's Indian positions as well. Well, more on that in a second. But it's very, very tense at the moment. So white is declining to push or to take, just leaving the tension in the position, inviting black to take here. But a3, now that's a useful move because it covers the b4 square in case black were to exchange here. a4. Aha, so some tactics at play here, and that makes a lot of sense to control this square. Of course, if white were to take this, then it's possible to play knight takes d4. If pawn takes, then bishop takes bishop, and if bishop takes bishop here, you have a Zwischenschach, a little intermezzo. You take with check and then recapture here. So you don't want to do that with white. You don't want to give up a centre pawn for a wing pawn. So finally white decides to fix the structure in the middle. The knight drops back, c4. So now you can see we've basically switched from a Spanish into a King's Indian pawn structure with these locked central pawns, and white has a space advantage. This is a nice pawn to have on a4 because white doesn't want to play b4 here because black would take en passant and those pawns are split and not very good. Black plays b6, and you can see without that b pawn then it's going to be hard for white to push forward with c5. So for the moment I think black can be pretty satisfied with the outcome of the opening. At the moment there isn't any kingside attack with f5. A lot of the struggle is going to revolve around whether black can achieve f5 and whether white wants to allow it and contain it, or well, we'll see anyway. Right, knight b1. So with the pawn structure fixed, that's when a lot of manoeuvring takes place, and you can understand why white wanted to bring this knight c3, attacking this pawn and potentially coming in here. There was potentially another route for that knight, which was to play it back here and maybe to g3, which could be very useful in case black wants to advance on the king's side. Then again, you might have to contend with b5 at some moment. So yeah, pros and cons to all these moves. So knight b1, it looks pretty good. And the rook comes back to f8. Yeah, there's no sense in standing on e8 in that position. Knight comes here, so 3 pieces attacking this pawn, only 2 pieces defending, so it needs a 3rd piece to defend that pawn. So it feels like this was a pretty good move to put the knight on c3. Bishop d3, so next plan for white is to put the knight on b5. Queen c8, so the queen switches and perhaps looks at a sacrifice as well. Knight b5, so that keeps black pegged to defending that pawn. You don't really want to exchange off here, that doesn't look right at all, because for example the rook could come here looking at c7 or perhaps come to c4 to take that one. So knight e8. And now I really like white's next move. It's clear that black is building up to playing f5. So queen d2 is an excellent move. Attacks this pawn. So black defends it. But notice with the king on h7 opposite the bishop on d3, that's rather uncomfortable in case black wants to play f5. So this is a very, very typical idea to drag the king up the board. And on this turn, white plays an incredibly provocative move. Knight h4. Given that it seems like f5 is coming, then, well, I think this is not a bad move. Knight c3 in readiness for f5. So if f5, then you could exchange and knight h4. Now, in that case, I think this is very nice for white. You can see this pin here prevents this pawn from advancing. The knight is very secure here and looks at that weakened square on g6. Might be possible even to attack with g4, maybe f4. That looks really nice. And if knight takes, well, queen c2, that's a nice little nudge. Just with a bit of pressure here, so not so easy for black to use the knight or use the f-file in any way. Of course, it's not necessary for black to play f5 immediately, but then you have to ask yourself, well, what is black doing? You know, this is sort of the whole point of black's play. And if black just passes, then I think I would be very interested in playing a move like king h2 and perhaps g4 and support that pawn with rook g1. And white may try to take the initiative on the king side. However, knight h4 played, I have to say, also very interesting. I think white would very much like to see f5 here. g5 played, so knight h4 was provoking this move g5, and we've seen this theme in a lot of games over the last few weeks. You know, I pointed out how Carlsen likes to tempt this move g5 to create weaknesses around the enemy king. Now the knight can't hop in here, it'll get taken, you lose a pawn, so the knight comes back. So this was just about provoking this move. And it means that when black plays f5, after the exchange, black has to recapture with a piece, which means that it's easier to occupy that square. But black doesn't need to play f5 yet. So knight g6. The knight hops back to c3. And knight f6. I think this is good strategy. I think it would be a mistake to play f5 here because white can exchange and has good control over e4. But this kind of thing is dangerous. And here is a big decision for white. It might not seem significant at the moment. But in a second, one of these knights is going to enter on f4. And then this bishop has to decide where to go. You don't want the knight to exchange it off. So it's either going to have to drop to f1 or it's going to have to go back to c2. If you go back to c2, then white's kingside could be vulnerable to a black attack. If it comes back to f1, then it's away from the king and it's perhaps easier to get in f5. Now white decides to play bishop f1 here. It's really hard to say which is best. It just changes the nature of the position, but it's quite important. So instead white could play knight h2 and then put the bishop back on c2. You can see it's still looking at the king. But after rook g8, then maybe king h8, stepping away from here. And bishop f8. Well, black is getting ready to push with g4 at some moment. It's really hard to say which is better. It's just a very double-edged position. But after almost 6 minutes, Avila played bishop f1, which is very understandable. Just giving those pawns a little bit of protection. I mean, over the last few moves, white always had to reckon with the bishop sacrifice. And now he's just preventing it. But now knight h5. The knight comes to e2, wants to look at that g3 square perhaps. But before the knight can get to g3, black breaks with f5. You can see without that bishop on this diagonal, it's a lot easier to achieve. So white doesn't want to allow that, of course. So pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn. Now white plays knight g3. Those knights getting in a bit of a tangle. I wonder whether this one would have been a better move, potentially with the idea g4. But this knight is going to come in here. I mean, I think, you know, black has pretty decent play here. I'm not saying the advantage, but yeah, clearly there's counterplay. Knight g3. The knight comes to f4 anyway. Well, this is what black wants. Even at the cost of giving up that beautiful light squared bishop, because you can see that knight controls the d3 square. That's really important. So that bishop can't get back into play on that diagonal, which would cause black enormous problems. White now plays knight h2. I mean, one thought I had was just to exchange off bishop for knight, because if black recaptures with a pawn, I mean, you'd like to play this to open up the g file, but then white is very much in the game. That looks really nasty. So after bishop takes, black would have to play knight takes, covering the d3 square, and then just rook e3. You know, that exchange has taken a bit of pressure off, particularly as white can get the rooks over. But black gets the rooks over, and then there's h5, bishop h6, with quite a nice initiative. It's not absolutely clear to me what white is doing in this position, although white is reasonably secure. But instead of that, instead of exchanging here, and I understand, you know, you don't want to give up a bishop necessarily. White played knight h2, but after e4, that bishop just breathes down the diagonal. And that pawn on a4 is looking like that was a very, very wise advance, as that b2 pawn is fixed. It's already quite difficult for white. And there we go. Yet another of my favourite themes. The good old octopus lands on d3. Well, white can't tolerate that. I mean, you know, very soon it could be supported by the next one coming here. b2 is attacked. So white exchanged that off, but of course the knight is replaced by an incredibly powerful pawn. And this next idea for black, we've also seen, if you think back to the Pyre-Niemann game, which was actually a King's Indian defence that I showed a couple of videos ago, then this theme cropped up actually. Okay, black to play. You ever think, I'll have a drink of tea? Cheers. What did Budisavljevic play here? b5. So undermining the support for that pawn on d5, and now black has a very clear advantage. Queen takes. So white's centre is destroyed. This pawn is still a real headache for white. That bishop still looks fantastic. Black's pieces look fantastic compared to white's. I mean, it's that bishop which is the really killer piece. Queen b4 played. It's very hard to give white good advice here. Rook here and rook e4. White is in massive trouble, so black is just beautifully active. Queen takes b5. White gets the pawn on d3, but now let me see. Black is one pawn up, but that is a big pawn, and those centre pawns beautiful actually. So they're well protected, covering some important squares and blocking out white's rooks. All black's pieces look good here. Knight f4. Yeah, let's throw that one in. And that wins pawn number 2, because if that's taken, then rook takes knight. So black is 2 pawns up. That looks like 3 pawns up to me. And white is lost here. Okay, that gets sort of one back. Okay, black is 2 pawns up, but now black has complete security. That's so nice with the bishop and pawn protecting each other. That one's dropping as well. And of course, this passed a pawn is looking really good too. And that was actually the final move of the game. White resigned very understandably. I mean, there really is nothing to do here. For example, I don't know, rook here. You can take that pawn. Checking does nothing. The king is secure. And black is just getting in. That can be taken. This rook has potential to swing around here. Of course, it's utterly lost. So, yeah, understandably, after a3, white resigned. So, Luka Budisavljevic leaps to the top. So, after 10 rounds, Budisavljevic is on 8. Marc-Andrea Morizzi from France is on 8 points. They share the lead and they play each other in the final round. And then there are 5 players on 7.5. Niemann, he won a good game. Niemann, Nestorov, Svana, Garibian and Subel. They're all on 7.5. So it's looking like a really tight finish. Anything could happen. I will try to cover the final round. I'm on the move again. But I will hopefully be able to catch up and let you know what happens. It's incredibly close. And yeah, these players, they are going to be the stars of the future. There's no doubt about it. Thanks for watching.